Hello and welcome to Frontrunner Motorsport. We've covered a lot of things on Carspiracy theories. Teams that have cheated, motorsport organisations taking liberties, a short man with short man complex ruining a race series because of his penis envy. But today we are looking at one of the most controversial figures in all of motorsport. No, not that one, although I could probably do a whole series on the things Bernie has done. No, today we are looking at the controversial life of Nelson Piquet, from the early days of his youth to the prankster playboy of his prime, and the exiled figure he now is. The three-time Formula 1 champion has controversy following his every footstep, from the very early days of his racing career to present day. We are going to look at some of the big ones, discuss them in detail, and maybe have a little chat about the man himself. This is episode 7 of Carspiracy Theory. Check out the playlist, subscribe to the channel, and let's jump into the video. It's hard to know where to begin. Do we go in chronological order, or order of severity, alphabetical? It's also worth noting Nelson Piquet is still alive, and there is always potential for a part 2 in the future. Nelson Piquet was apparently a talented tennis player, but grew bored of the sport and took up karting instead, which is super relatable. He hid his name for fear of upsetting his parents, mostly his father, Estácio Sotomayor, who was a Brazilian politician, the Minister of Health, who was eventually impeached in 1969 during a power grab by dictator President Artur da Costa El Silva. The reason we know him as Piquet is because he took his mother's maiden name to hide his motor racing shame. He dropped out of an engineering course at university and worked in a garage to support his career. He wasn't getting any help from his family, probably because he'd wasted a tennis scholarship and a university course in an attempt to go motor racing. Luckily, his dad died a few years before Nelson got into Formula 1, and therefore posed little problem as the Brazilian moved from Brazil to Europe and took the record number of wins in Formula 3 away from Jackie Stewart. Racing in Formula 1 for Ensign in 1978, his career exploded from there. Nelson Piquet joined Brabham late into 1978. Niki Lauda left the team towards the end of 1979, making the young Piquet effectively team leader, and just a year later, he was a genuine title contender. There's no doubt he was one of the most talented drivers of his day. By 1981, he was a Formula 1 world champion, a meteoric rise in one of the sport's most competitive ages. There were also very few controversies from this time, despite being employed by Bernie Ecclestone. The biggest from his Brabham days has to be physically assaulting Eliseo Salazar after the pair made contact. Piquet was leading the 1982 German Grand Prix when he collided with Salazar in a much slower ATS. Piquet showing his kung fu on live TV probably lost him a lot of the respect he had gained from stopping at Didier Pironi's massive crash in practice a couple of days before. As unintelligent a response punching someone wearing a helmet might seem, I would personally give him a pass. 1982 was a difficult season for Piquet. He was never really in contention to retain his title, and the Brabham BMW was incredibly unreliable, which must have been very frustrating. He did go on to take a second title in 1983, and later took a third with Williams. It was during that third title-winning campaign of 1987 that Nelson Piquet had a massive crash at Imola. He has said he was never quite right after this crash, with it affecting his eyesight and causing psychological symptoms like insomnia, which, if this is true, he should have retired from racing at that point for his own sake. He still went on to be world champion that year at Nigel Mansell's expense, but the rift between the pair and between Piquet and Williams saw him move over to a Lotus team declining in fortunes. Piquet was never a top-tier driver beyond this point. He did take 3 wins for Benetton before his eventual retirement after the 1991 season, but these wins were inherited from other drivers failing to finish or hitting misfortune. In 1987, he was even getting treatment in secret for fear of being forced to retire. Whilst at Williams, he was teammates with Nigel Mansell. The dour Brummie legend was not a friend of Piquet's, especially after 1988. In an interview for a magazine, he called Nigel Mansell an uneducated blockhead, which is harmless enough, maybe is just said in jest. He then said Mansell's wife was ugly. and Piquet would know because he's had several. Luckily, Piquet was no longer at Williams, having moved to Lotus, and Nigel managed to refrain from punching him in the face repeatedly. It was also around this time he called fellow Brazilian Ayrton Senna gay, and the founding father of the sport's greatest entity, Enzo Ferrari, senile. Clearly, Piquet was taking no prisoners, and he never got to drive for Ferrari for some reason. After Ayrton Senna's death, Piquet was asked who was the better driver of the two. If you're expecting a respectful response like, there will never be another Ayrton Senna or the like, then you don't know Nelson Piquet. His response was, he was better because he was alive. I think the animosity for Senna must come from the fact that whilst they were both great drivers, Piquet never matched Senna's level of being idolised by the world as a whole. Merely being acknowledged as a great racing driver was not enough for Piquet. He would make numerous mentions of Ayrton Senna's sexuality, apparently even wearing a shirt proclaiming himself to be Brazil's fastest straight racing driver. He has continued to make remarks about Senna even into the 2020s. Ayrton Senna has been dead for 30 years and still lives rent-free in Piquet's head. Things go quiet for a decade and a bit for Piquet. He retires from motorsport after a couple of failed attempts at the Indy 500 and 24 Hours of Le Mans. He started businesses outside of Formula 1 and continued to live the Brazilian playboy lifestyle, only occasionally popping up to remind people that Ayrton Senna was indeed a gay boy. In 2000, he formed his own racing team to support the career of his son, Nelson Piquet Jr., who was taking his first steps into motorsport. In 2007, Piquet Jr. became a test driver for Renault, and in 2008 was moved to a full-time Formula 1 seat alongside Fernando Alonso. After a crash in Singapore led to Renault taking their first win since 2006, things took a turn for the worse. It was all fine at first, although allegedly that might change soon. In 2009, Nelson Piquet Jr. was about to be dropped by Renault when a leak came out about Piquet being asked to crash to help Alonso win. It turns out that Nelson Piquet Jr. had told his father, after the race, that he was asked to crash, and they both kept silent, until Renault tried to drop the young Brazilian. What happened next was a lawsuit from Renault for false allegations and attempted blackmail, a case that the Piquets eventually won. I'll cover Crashgate in more detail in a future video. It's best to see what happens with Felipe Massa's lawsuit against the FIA, because that might finally be the full stop of the 2008 Singapore Grand Prix, at least until the appeals continue on for another decade. We'll call this a net draw for Piquet because whilst he did win out against Renault in the end, he did hold on to the information for over a year and only released it when it benefited him and his family. Everyone involved has gone on to do just fine, by the way. Piquet Jr. is a Formula E champion and still races in Brazil. Flavio Briatore has recently come back as an ambassador, which says a lot about the culture of Formula 1 behind closed doors, I think. Alonso is still in F1 as are Renault, although now as Alpine, and with no Piquets hired since 2009. This video could go on for a very long time, so let's skip to the most recent and potentially long-lasting in terms of damage for Nelson Piquet. In 2021, he gave an interview where he went on the attack. For some reason. I don't actually know why he decided to use racial and homophobic slurs against Lewis Hamilton. It involved the British Grand Prix of 2021 when Lewis Hamilton took out Max Verstappen, who happens to be dating Piquet's daughter. He used a Portuguese slur to insinuate that Hamilton was small in stature. Despite the podcast being recorded in 2021, it didn't get worldwide attention until 2022, and despite a heartfelt apology where Piquet stated they were not meant to be racist, unfortunately some older interviews were dug up from 2016 where Piquet referred to Hamilton as the same thing, as well as insinuating that much like his idol Ayrton Senna, Lewis Hamilton was indeed gay. Saying the reason he lost Nico Rosberg was because he must have been giving a lot of ass at the time. He was that bad. A sentence I had to read several times to even come close to understanding what he meant. I think his attack on the Rosbergs was far worse than what he said about Lewis Hamilton. He referred to Keke Rosberg as a turd with no value, and later on in another interview as worthless. This isn't the first time he's had a pop at Keke Rosberg. When Keke Rosberg called a press event to announce his retirement, Nelson Piquet called one too and announced he wasn't retiring, and gave a speech that had a lot of similarities to Rosberg's. I don't even know what he had against the Finnish champion. As for Lewis Hamilton, I don't really know what Nelson Piquet has against him either. In response to this, Nelson Piquet has been banned from the Formula 1 paddock, his British Race Drivers Club membership was cancelled, and he was fined $1 million by a Brazilian court. Some publications labelled this a great success for Lewis Hamilton, but I would disagree. Nelson Piquet has not paid the fine, and is unlikely to do so, and clearly doesn't really care all that much. He's hardly struggling with his vast fortune, several businesses, strong political connections in Brazil, and a ton of family around him. He's really got away with it scot-free, and the world has moved on, waiting patiently for his next controversial moment. So in 2023, Nelson Piquet, who had been a strong supporter of himself controversial Brazilian president Jair Bolsonaro. Now, I was going to do a video about this at the time, but I didn't because I don't know enough about Brazilian politics, and there is a lot of interesting things about Jair Bolsonaro to discuss, that I will leave to the Brazilians among us to do a better job than I ever could of explaining it. But Nelson Piquet had to get involved somehow. Apparently he lent a shed to Bolsonaro to store some Saudi jewels he had obtained perfectly legally. Well, he was gifted them whilst in office and didn't declare them so he could keep them for himself, and probably gave Piquet a nice cheque to store them out of public view, I guess. Piquet also called current Brazilian president Lula da Silva a son of a bitch, and ended a speech by saying he was going to make sure he ends up in a cemetery. This has been a pretty heavy video, so let's end with some of the practical jokes Nelson Piquet was apparently known for. There were a few practical jokers in the history of Formula 1 like Ayrton Senna and Gerhard Berger, but Piquet has a list of stories longer than the Bible. So here is just some highlights. Getting mechanics to try and fix something in the cockpit and then farting on them. Wearing a World War II Stormtrooper helmet to a test session for Brabham's new BMW engines. Driving around London at ludicrous speed in the rain and splashing pedestrians. When he and Nigel Mansell were testing for Williams, apparently Piquet got wind that Mansell had a bit of a dicky tummy and removed every roll of toilet paper in the near vicinity. Oh, and poking Nigel Mansell in the ribs repeatedly after he broke them in a crash. Nice guy this Piquet, absolute gentleman to be sure. In conclusion, I don't think Nelson Piquet is really a racist or even homophobic. It's more like that 12-year-old edgelord you distance yourself from because they draw swastikas on their math book and wear a black trench coat to school. He might be the most immature person to ever take part in Formula 1. He really has lived with a playboy lifestyle with his many wives, large family and lack of social graces. He was also an immensely talented race driver. Formula 1 really peaked in the 1980s. Any other era, Senna, Prost, Mansell and Piquet would have won about 10 titles each. Instead, they had to share them between themselves, causing other top drivers like Riccardo Patrese and Gerhard Berger to miss out completely. Not to mention the likes of Niki Lauda, John Watson, Keke Rosberg and others were also racing at the time. Almost all of them fell victim to prankmeister Nelson Piquet. He may have the talent of a golden god, but he has the personality of pig slurry. What's really infuriating about Piquet is he can do all of these things and he's fine. He's loaded, has successful kids, successful businesses, he still attends racing events with friends. At the Le Mans Classic a couple of years ago, he said he didn't do anything wrong. But most hilariously of all, Bernie Ecclestone has come to his defence, stating, "I've known Nelson for an awful long time. I was with him a couple of weeks ago. It's not the sort of thing Nelson would say meaning something bad. He probably thinks a lot of things he says which might upset us or might feel a little bit offensive. To him, it's nothing. It's just part of conversation. Nelson would never go out of his way to say anything bad. Certainly." And if Bernie Ecclestone says it, it must be true. So if you want more Nelson Piquet controversy videos, let me know in the comments below. If you have a favourite controversy I haven't covered, put it down there too, as well as any personal favourite stories of Piquet you might have. There is more coming controversy, I'm sure. He has already waded into the Masters 2008 championship debate, saying he was treated like a dog, and as the court case continues and Piquet inevitably gets drawn into it, at the very least to give evidence, then I'm sure more words will leave Nelson Piquet's mouth worthy of another video. I'm aware that what he said wasn't the same as the other N-word and that has been used in his defence. I know it shouldn't be taken in the same vein, but he didn't need to say it. I am neither going to condemn or exonerate him for it. There's plenty of evidence above for you to make your own decisions about the guy. Make sure you subscribe to the channel for more motorsport content. Thank you very much for watching, and have a good one.